At the end of the 19th century, America moved at the pace of muscle and habit. Horses pulled wagons through muddy streets. Blacksmiths shaped metal by hand. Factories existed, but they breathed slowly, bound by human skill and physical limits. Production was personal, imperfect, and time-consuming. The nation was industrializing, yes, but it had not yet learned how to move fast. In this world, speed was not power. It was simply a constraint. Then a question emerged, quiet at first, almost invisible beneath the noise of progress. What happens when speed itself becomes power? What happens when the ability to move faster than everyone else determines who dominates markets, labor, and eventually nations? The man who would force America to confront that question did not look like a revolutionary. Henry Ford was not born into wealth or aristocracy. He did not inherit factories or titles. He never attended a university, never trained as an engineer in the formal sense. He was not celebrated as a great inventor in the tradition of Edison or Tesla. In fact, many of the technologies he used already existed. Yet Ford would reshape American life more profoundly than most geniuses of his era. His power did not come from invention, but from obsession. While others focused on improving products, Ford fixated on process. He was less interested in what was being built than in how fast it could be built, how cheaply, and how consistently. Where his contemporaries saw craftsmanship, Ford saw inefficiency. Where they saw labor, he saw delay. This is the paradox at the heart of his legacy. Henry Ford did not invent the automobile. He did not invent the engine, the factory, or even the idea of assembling parts. What he invented was something far more consequential, a system that subordinated human rhythm to mechanical time. Before Ford, production followed the worker. After Ford, the worker followed the production. By reorganizing labor around speed, repetition, and standardization, Ford rewired the relationship between humans and machines. Time itself became a unit to be optimized. Movement was no longer organic, it was measured, divided, and enforced. The factory stopped being a place where things were made, and became a machine in its own right, one that consumed human effort and converted it into output at an unprecedented scale. This transformation did not simply change industry. It altered society's expectations. Once speed proved profitable, it became mandatory. Once efficiency proved dominant, resistance became irrational. A nation that had once moved at the pace of horses began to beat with a mechanical pulse. Henry Ford did not rule through politics or ideology. He ruled through tempo. By accelerating production, he accelerated life itself. And in doing so, he changed not just what America made, but how America moved, worked, and ultimately understood power. Ford did not invent the car. He invented the modern system of production. And once that system took hold, there was no turning back. Before Henry Ford reshaped American production, manufacturing was powerful but exclusive. At the dawn of the 20th century, the United States was already an industrial nation, yet its factories moved without a unifying rhythm. Production existed, but scale did not. Efficiency was admired, but not mastered. What America had was industry without tempo. Nowhere was this clearer than in the automobile. In the early 1900s, cars were not products in the modern sense. They were bespoke creations. Each vehicle was assembled largely by hand, crafted by skilled workers who shaped, fitted, and adjusted components individually. No two cars were exactly alike. This craftsmanship gave automobiles an aura of prestige, but it came at a cost: time, money, and accessibility. A single automobile could take weeks, even months, to complete. Prices reflected this reality. Cars cost more than many homes. They were symbols of wealth, not tools of everyday life. To own an automobile was to announce status, not practicality. The road, in theory, was public, but mobility itself was private, reserved for those who could afford it. This system relied on labor that was both highly skilled and deeply constrained. Workers were trained artisans, not interchangeable hands. Their value lay in experience, intuition, and manual precision. Production moved at the speed of human ability, and that speed had a ceiling. Fatigue, error, and variation were unavoidable. Output was limited not by demand, but by endurance. In this world, manufacturing was closer to art than industry. The factory resembled a workshop, and the worker resembled a craftsman. Pride was embedded in the object. Time was absorbed into quality, but scale was sacrificed in the process. America as a nation accepted this trade-off. Industry existed to serve wealth, not to empower the masses. The logic was implicit: complex machines were not meant for everyone. Technology, like culture, was hierarchical. Some people consumed, others labored. Progress trickled downward, slowly, selectively. This belief shaped the broader economy. Many sectors operated on similar principles: small batches, high prices, skilled labor, and limited reach. Productivity increased gradually, but explosively transformative growth remained elusive. The country had factories, but it did not yet have a system that could synchronize them. What America lacked was rhythm. There was no standardized tempo connecting worker to worker, factory to factory, city to city. Each operation functioned in isolation, governed by local customs and individual expertise. Output fluctuated, costs were unpredictable. Expansion required more artisans, not better organization. This absence of rhythm had consequences. Without speed, prices stayed high. Without consistency, mass consumption remained a fantasy. Without scale, industry could not fully reshape daily life. The Industrial Revolution had begun, but it had not yet taken control. And yet, beneath the surface, pressure was building. Urban populations were growing. Roads were expanding. A new middle class was emerging, hungry for mobility, efficiency, and access. The demand for movement existed, but the means did not. The system was straining against its own limits. The automobile industry, in particular, stood at a crossroads. It could remain an elite craft, producing symbols of distinction for the wealthy. Or it could become something radically different, a standardized machine for ordinary people. But to choose the second path required more than better engines. It required a complete rethinking of labor, time, and control. It required stripping production of individuality and replacing it with coordination. It required sacrificing artistry for repetition, autonomy for speed. Before Henry Ford, America was unwilling or unable to make that trade. It had industry, but not industrial dominance. It had machines, but not momentum. Production was impressive, but fragmented. The nation stood on the edge of transformation, unaware that what it was missing was not technology, but tempo. And when that tempo arrived, it would not merely change how things were made. It would decide who could afford them, who would work how long, and who would ultimately shape the future of American power. Henry Ford did not begin his life at the center of American industry. He began on its margins on a farm in rural Michigan, surrounded not by factories or capital, but by dirt, animals, and repetition. Born in 1863, Ford grew up in a world ruled by daylight and seasons, where labor was slow, physical, and endless. From an early age, he knew one thing with certainty: this was not the life he wanted. Ford hated farm work, not because it was hard, but because it was inefficient. He saw endless hours consumed by tasks that yielded little progress. Horses grew tired. Humans aged. Time disappeared. To Ford, agriculture felt like submission to nature's pace, a pace he instinctively resisted. Where others accepted slowness as fate, Ford experienced it as an insult. What fascinated him were machines. As a boy, Ford was drawn obsessively to mechanical devices: watches, engines, anything with moving parts. He took things apart not to admire craftsmanship, but to understand function. He wanted to know what made machines faster, simpler, more obedient to human intention. While others valued durability or beauty, Ford valued speed and repetition. This obsession followed him into adulthood. He left the farm, worked as a machinist, and later as an engineer. But his early career was anything but smooth. Ford failed repeatedly. His first automobile companies collapsed. Investors lost patience. Partners walked away. At one point, his name was associated more with disappointment than promise. By conventional standards, Ford was not impressive. He was not formally educated. He did not move comfortably in elite business circles. He was not a gifted administrator, nor a charismatic manager of people. He lacked polish. He lacked diplomacy. He often lacked consensus. What he possessed instead was fixation. Ford returned to the same question again and again, with almost pathological persistence: how can this be done faster? Not better. Not more elegantly. Faster. More repeatable. More predictable. He was less interested in invention than in process. He did not dream of the perfect car. He dreamed of a system that never slowed down, This was his true divergence from his contemporaries. Most early automakers asked how to improve performance, luxury, or craftsmanship. Ford asked a different question entirely: how can an ordinary person afford this? To him, a car that only the wealthy could buy was a failure not technically, but morally and strategically. Technology, in Ford's view, had no value if it could not spread. Speed, for Ford, was not merely mechanical, it was social. Faster production meant lower costs. Lower costs meant wider access. Wider access meant scale. And scale, once achieved, reshaped everything it touched. Ironically, Ford was poorly suited to managing complexity. He disliked meetings, distrusted experts, and often ignored advice. Yet this weakness pushed him toward simplification. He stripped decisions down to essentials. He removed variation. He reduced options. Where others saw nuance, Ford saw friction. His failures reinforced this mindset. Every collapse taught him that unpredictability was the enemy. Investors changed their minds. Markets fluctuated. Skilled workers varied in output. The only solution, Ford concluded, was control not over people, but over time. He wanted production to move at a pace no individual could disrupt. This fixation made him an outsider even within his own company. Engineers argued. Managers complained. Craftsmen resisted. Ford persisted. He was willing to discard tradition, pride, even human comfort in pursuit of speed. Not because he was cruel, but because he believed that once speed was mastered, everything else would follow. Ford did not romanticize labor. He did not believe work should be fulfilling or expressive. He believed it should be efficient. In his worldview, the dignity of labor came not from creativity, but from stability, steady wages, predictable hours, affordable products. Meaning, he thought, came after survival. This philosophy unsettled many. It stripped work of artistry and reduced it to motion. But it also hinted at something revolutionary, a society organized around flow rather than hierarchy. Henry Ford was not a visionary in the poetic sense. He was a systems thinker before the term existed. He saw the world as a sequence of delays waiting to be eliminated. His genius was not invention, but compression, the compression of time, cost, and human effort into a single, relentless rhythm. He did not ask how good a car could be. He asked how fast the world could move once everyone had one. Henry Ford did not invent the assembly line. The idea already existed in fragments in slaughterhouses, in mills, in isolated industrial experiments, where objects moved and workers repeated tasks. What Ford did was far more consequential. He industrialized the concept, disciplined it, and scaled it until it became the defining mechanism of modern production. The true invention was not a machine. It was a system. At Ford's Highland Park plant in Michigan, a radical reversal took place. For centuries, workers had moved around a product, fetching tools, adjusting parts, adapting each step to the object in front of them. Highland Park turned that logic upside down. The worker stopped moving. The product did. Conveyor belts carried partially assembled automobiles past rows of stationary laborers. Each worker performed one small, precise action: tighten a bolt, attach a component, inspect a joint, then repeated it again and again, hour after hour. Motion was no longer human. Motion was mechanical. The effect was immediate and astonishing. Before the assembly line, building a single Model T took more than 12 hours. After Highland Park reached full synchronization, that time collapsed to 93 minutes. What had once been a slow craft became a relentless flow. Output surged, costs plummeted. Speed became measurable, predictable, and endlessly optimizable. This was the moment when Ford's obsession crystallized into dominance. By breaking production into tiny, repeatable tasks, Ford eliminated dependence on highly skilled labor. Workers no longer needed years of training. They needed obedience to rhythm. Anyone could be inserted into the system. Anyone could be replaced. Labor became modular. From a business perspective, this was revolutionary. The factory no longer revolved around individual ability, it revolved around time. Delays could be identified. Bottlenecks eliminated. Every second could be studied, shaved, and reassigned. The factory became a living diagram of efficiency. But the human consequences were profound. Work was simplified, but also stripped of meaning. The craftsman disappeared, replaced by the operator. Pride in the finished product gave way to exhaustion from repetition. The worker no longer saw a car being built, only the same motion, performed thousands of times. Humans became extensions of the machine. Ford understood this cost, but he accepted it. To him, the assembly line was not dehumanizing, it was democratizing. By reducing labor complexity, he could reduce wages per unit while increasing total pay. By accelerating production, he could lower prices. By lowering prices, he could expand ownership. The Model T ceased to be a luxury. It became transportation. The assembly line did not just change factories. It rewired society. Time itself became standardized. Shifts, schedules, quotas, and metrics replaced intuition and flexibility. Life began to orbit production cycles. Cities expanded around factories. Roads multiplied. Consumer culture emerged, fed by cheap, abundant goods. Yet the moral tension remained unresolved. Was this progress or alienation? Critics argued that Ford had turned people into cogs, sacrificing human creativity on the altar of efficiency. Philosophers warned that repetition would hollow out the soul. Workers protested monotony, injuries, and psychological strain. The system demanded discipline, not individuality. Supporters countered that the alternative was worse. Without speed and scale, goods would remain scarce, expensive, and exclusive. Without standardization, the middle class would never grow. Without the assembly line, modern prosperity would stall. Ford himself rarely engaged with the ethical debate. He believed outcomes justified methods. If millions could afford cars, if wages rose, if productivity soared, then the system worked. Meaning, he assumed, would follow material security. What is undeniable is this: the assembly line redefined power. Those who controlled production speed controlled markets. Those who mastered scale shaped demand. The ability to compress time became a form of dominance. Nations would later adopt this logic for war, logistics, and governance. The battlefield, like the factory floor, would be reorganized around flow. Highland Park was not just a factory. It was a prototype for the 20th century. In that space, progress accelerated, and with it, a permanent question was born. When efficiency becomes supreme, what happens to the human being inside the system? Henry Ford answered with machines. History is still debating whether that answer was salvation or surrender. The Model T was not remarkable because it was beautiful. It was remarkable because it was everywhere. When Henry Ford introduced it in 1908, he was not aiming to impress elites or redefine luxury. He was aiming to erase distance. The Model T was designed to survive abuse, to be repaired by ordinary hands, and to function on imperfect roads. It was not a symbol, it was a tool. That was precisely why it changed the world. Before the Model T, mobility was stratified. The wealthy traveled by automobile. Everyone else relied on horses, trains, or their own feet. Movement was constrained by geography and income. Distance meant separation. Opportunity was local. To live far from work was impractical. To travel freely was a privilege. Ford attacked that structure directly. The Model T was cheap not by accident, but by design. Every choice reflected Ford's obsession with cost reduction, standardized parts, minimal options, simple engineering. Any customer can have a car painted any color that he wants, Ford famously said, so long as it is black. Black paint dried faster. Faster meant cheaper. Cheaper meant accessible. Durability was equally central. The Model T could withstand mud, dust, snow, and neglect. It was built for farmers, laborers, and small-town families, not for smooth city boulevards. Repairs were simple. Replacement parts were interchangeable. Ownership did not require expertise, only necessity. As prices fell, ownership exploded. What had once been a luxury reserved for the upper class became a practical purchase for the working and middle classes. By the 1920s, millions of Americans owned cars. The automobile ceased to be a status object and became an extension of daily life. This was the democratization of movement. With it came a cascade of changes that reshaped the physical and social landscape of the United States. Roads, once local and inconsistent, became a national priority. Governments paved highways, connected cities, and standardized signage. Infrastructure followed demand, and demand followed accessibility. Gas stations appeared along newly traveled routes. Motels emerged. Diners followed traffic. Entire industries were born to serve the moving population. The economy began to organize itself around the assumption that people and goods were in constant motion. Cities changed. People no longer needed to live near factories or rail lines. Suburbs expanded outward, promising space, privacy and separation from industrial congestion. The daily commute became possible, the boundaries between work, home, and leisure stretched. Time itself was reorganized. The Model T also altered culture. Freedom was redefined. Young people escaped supervision. Rural families accessed markets and entertainment. Courtship, commerce, and community life expanded beyond walking distance. The road became a symbol of autonomy. Ford did not simply sell vehicles. He sold a new relationship with space. And in doing so, he reshaped consumption. A mobile population demanded more goods, delivered faster. Retail expanded. Tourism grew. Advertising followed the car. The economy became not just productive, but circulatory, dependent on constant movement. Critics worried about what was lost. Local identities weakened. Traditional rhythms dissolved. Nature was disrupted. Accidents increased. Dependence on oil deepened. Mobility brought freedom but also fragmentation. Ford remained largely indifferent to these concerns. He measured success in scale. If millions moved, the system worked. If prices fell, the mission was fulfilled. He believed progress was cumulative, not contemplative. What made the Model T revolutionary was not its engineering, but its reach. It connected people to markets, jobs, and each other. It redefined what was near and what was far. It transformed isolation into access. In this sense, Ford did not merely democratize transportation. He democratized possibility. The Model T made movement ordinary. And once movement became ordinary, the world itself became negotiable. America did not just start driving. It started expanding geographically, economically, psychologically. Henry Ford did not sell cars. He sold the idea that life should not stay where it began. In 1914, Henry Ford announced a decision that stunned the industrial world. He would pay his workers $5 a day, more than double the prevailing wage. Newspapers called it revolutionary. Reformers praised it as enlightened capitalism. Workers flooded Detroit, desperate for a place on Ford's factory floor. But the $5 day was not an act of charity. It was an instrument of control. Ford's factories were facing a crisis. The assembly line, for all its efficiency, was brutal on the human psyche. Repetitive motion, relentless pace, and mechanical discipline drove workers away. Turnover soared. In some departments, Ford had to hire hundreds of men each year to keep a few dozen positions filled. Speed was useless without stability. Ford's solution was economic pressure disguised as generosity. By doubling wages, he did not liberate workers, he anchored them. A job at Ford became too valuable to lose. Absenteeism fell. Quitting became unthinkable. The assembly line could now run continuously, staffed by men who endured monotony because the cost of leaving was higher than the cost of staying. The wage was a leash. Higher pay also enforced discipline. Workers who arrived late, drank excessively, or violated factory rules risked losing a salary no other employer would match. Obedience became rational. Loyalty became survival. But Ford's vision went further. He understood that a worker who earned more could consume more. And a worker who consumed became part of the system's feedback loop. Ford workers could now afford the very cars they built. Production fed wages. Wages fed consumption. Consumption justified more production. The factory no longer ended at the gates, it extended into society. This was industrial soft power. Ford did not need force, he needed dependency. To protect this system, Ford expanded control beyond the factory floor. He created the sociological department, an internal surveillance arm tasked with evaluating workers' private lives. Inspectors visited homes. They questioned spouses. They examined hygiene, spending habits, language use, and moral behavior. Workers were expected to live properly. Alcohol abuse, gambling, debt, or non-conforming lifestyles could disqualify a worker from receiving the full $5 wage. Immigrants were encouraged to abandon old customs and assimilate into Ford's vision of American life. English lessons were offered not purely as education, but as standardization. Time, too, was regulated. The factory clock dictated daily rhythm. Shifts structured sleep. Wages structured ambition. Leisure was tolerated only insofar as it did not disrupt productivity. Ford believed that a stable worker required a stable life, and that stability could be engineered. Critics accused him of paternalism. Labor leaders warned that high wages masked authoritarian control. Privacy, they argued, was being traded for paychecks. But resistance was limited. Few workers were willing to challenge a system that fed their families and elevated their status. The $5 day reshaped labor relations across America. Other manufacturers were forced to respond. Wages rose. Expectations changed. The idea that mass production required mass consumption became doctrine. Ford had demonstrated something profound: power did not always need coercion. It could be purchased. By tying economic security to conformity, Ford aligned personal survival with corporate goals. The worker's interest became indistinguishable from the factory's interest. Obedience was no longer imposed, it was chosen. This model would echo far beyond Detroit. Corporations would adopt benefits, pensions, and salaries, not as moral commitments, but as tools of retention and influence. Governments would later apply similar logic through welfare, employment, and credit. Ford had blurred the boundary between employer and governor. He did not rule through violence. He ruled through pay, and in doing so, he revealed a central truth of the modern industrial world: those who control livelihoods can shape behavior, beliefs, and time itself. The $5 day was not just a wage. It was a quiet contract: prosperity in exchange for submission. Fordism was never just a factory method. It was an ideology, a way of organizing society around production, consumption, and time. What began on the factory floors of Detroit evolved into a global blueprint for modern civilization. At its core, Fordism rested on a simple but powerful equation: mass production required mass consumption, and mass consumption required wages high enough to sustain it. The assembly line could flood markets with goods, but without buyers, speed meant nothing. Ford solved this paradox by binding labor and consumption into a single system. Workers were no longer merely producers. They were the market. This idea transformed capitalism from a system of scarcity into a system of abundance. Under Fordism, efficiency became a moral virtue. Standardization replaced variation. Interchangeable parts replaced craftsmanship. Predictability replaced improvisation. The factory became a laboratory where time, motion, and human behavior were measured, optimized, and enforced. The implications extended far beyond automobiles. Entire industries adopted Fordist principles: steel, appliances, textiles, food processing. Products became cheaper, identical, and widely available. Choice expanded not through customization, but through volume. The modern consumer society was born not in shopping malls, but in factories. Governments took notice. In the United States, Fordism aligned naturally with industrial capitalism. High wages supported a growing middle class. Productivity increases fueled economic expansion. During the mid-20th century, this model underpinned American prosperity. Suburbs, consumer credit, and mass marketing all rested on Fordist foundations. But Fordism did not remain American. In Germany, industrial planners studied Ford's methods with intensity. Efficiency, discipline, and scale appealed to a nation seeking economic revival. Assembly lines became symbols of national strength. Production was linked to order. Speed became synonymous with power. In the Soviet Union, Fordism was adopted with ideological inversion. The USSR rejected capitalism, yet embraced its most effective machinery. Soviet planners invited American engineers, studied Ford's factories, and replicated assembly line logic in massive state-owned plants. The goal was not profit but output. Fordism became a tool of socialist industrialization. This paradox revealed Fordism's true nature: it was politically neutral but structurally dominant. Capitalist or communist, democratic or authoritarian, any system seeking rapid industrial growth turned to the assembly line. Standardized production proved irresistible. It delivered scale, control, and predictability. Education systems followed. Schools adopted schedules, standardized curricula, age-based cohorts, and testing mirroring factory organization. Bureaucracies adopted forms, procedures, and hierarchies modeled on industrial efficiency. Even warfare became Fordist, with standardized equipment, mass logistics, and production-driven strategy. The assembly line became a measure of civilization. To industrialize was to modernize. To modernize was to adopt Fordist logic. Nations without mass production were labeled backward. Development became synonymous with factories. Yet beneath its successes lay unresolved tensions. Fordism demanded conformity. It privileged sameness over creativity. It rewarded obedience over experimentation. While it raised living standards, it also flattened individuality. Critics warned that societies organized entirely around production risked becoming efficient but hollow. By the late 20th century, cracks appeared. Automation, globalization, and digital technology began to challenge rigid standardization. Flexible production and information-based economies emerged. Yet even as Fordism declined in form, it persisted in structure. The logic remains. Scale matters. Speed matters. Consumption sustains power. Wages stabilize systems. Time is money. Fordism outlived Henry Ford because it answered a universal question: how do you organize millions of people to produce more than they ever have before? The answer reshaped the world. Factories, cities, governments, and habits still move to rhythms first synchronized in Detroit. The assembly line may now be invisible, embedded in algorithms and supply chains, but its logic governs daily life. Ford did not merely change how things were made. He defined how modern societies function, and in doing so, he ensured that the factory would become not just a workplace, but a worldview. When the world slid into total war, Henry Ford's assembly line revealed its most consequential transformation. What had once been a commercial innovation became a strategic weapon. Factories were no longer merely places of production, they became instruments of national power. In the age of industrial war, the ability to manufacture at scale mattered as much as armies in the field. World War I was the first signal. As Europe burned, the United States discovered that modern war was not won only by generals, but by machines, logistics, and output. Ford's plants, already optimized for speed and uniformity, pivoted toward military needs with remarkable efficiency. Trucks, ambulances, engines, and parts flowed from civilian lines to the battlefield. The war demonstrated a new truth: industry could decide the fate of nations. But it was World War II that fully revealed the geopolitical force of Fordism. By the late 1930s, the United States faced a stark choice. It could remain an arsenal for others, or become the industrial core of a new world order. Ford's methods offered the answer. The same principles that had democratized the automobile: standardization, interchangeable parts, relentless speed, were applied to weapons of war. Ford Motor Company became a pillar of the American war economy. Its most iconic contribution was the Willow Run plant, built to mass-produce the B-24 Liberator bomber. The scale was unprecedented. A single factory stretched nearly a mile long. At peak efficiency, a bomber rolled off the line every hour. What had once taken weeks or months was compressed into minutes. This was not craftsmanship. It was industrial might. Planes were no longer handcrafted machines built by specialists. They were standardized objects, assembled by thousands of workers performing precise, repeatable tasks. Ford's logic turned the bomber into a product and war into a production problem. The implications were enormous. While Axis powers relied on skilled labor, dispersed factories, and limited resources, the United States leveraged scale. American industry outproduced its enemies not incrementally, but overwhelmingly. Tanks, trucks, jeeps, aircraft, engines flowed across oceans in numbers that reshaped strategy itself. Military planners adapted to abundance. Losses could be replaced. Campaigns could be sustained. Attrition became survivable. In this sense, Ford's assembly line did more than support the war, it redefined it. For the first time, industrial capacity became a direct measure of geopolitical strength. Power no longer rested solely in territory or population, but in throughput. The nation that could build faster could endure longer. Victory favored factories as much as soldiers. Ford himself embodied the contradictions of this transformation. A known isolationist, he initially opposed American entry into war. Yet when mobilization came, his system proved indispensable. Personal ideology yielded to structural reality. The machine he had built was larger than him, and once activated, it served the state. This marked a turning point in American history. Industry and government fused into a single operational force. The line between private enterprise and national strategy blurred. Corporations became extensions of state power. Executives sat alongside generals. Production schedules influenced battle plans. The United States emerged from the war with its homeland untouched, its industrial base expanded, and its technological capacity unmatched. Europe and Asia lay in ruins. The imbalance was absolute. Fordism had scaled from factory to nation. After the war, the lesson was clear: industrial capacity was no longer just economic, it was geopolitical. Nations that lacked it would depend on those who possessed it. Those who controlled production would shape alliances, dictate reconstruction, and define the future. This was the quiet revolution behind American dominance. The assembly line, once a tool to make cars affordable, had become a foundation of global power. It enabled the United States to project influence without occupying every territory, to lead without formal empire. The factory replaced the fortress. Output replaced conquest. In this new world, wars would still be fought with weapons, but won by systems. Henry Ford did not design tanks to rule the globe. Yet by redefining how things were made, he altered how power itself was measured. Factories became weapons. Production became strategy. Speed became sovereignty. And from that moment on, no nation could claim great power status without first mastering the logic Ford unleashed. The age of industrial geopolitics had begun. Henry Ford's greatest legacy is not measured in cars sold or factories built. It is measured in something far larger, far more enduring: the logic by which the modern world operates. Long after the Model T vanished from roads and Ford himself passed into history, the system he unleashed continued to expand quietly, relentlessly into every corner of human production. After Ford, no industry remained untouched. Electronics adopted his principles. Smartphones, laptops, and semiconductors are not crafted, they are assembled through hyper-optimized supply chains, broken into micro-tasks distributed across continents. Fashion followed the same path. Clothing moved from seasonal craftsmanship to fast, mass production, where speed and volume matter more than individuality. Trends are no longer created slowly, they are manufactured at scale. Technology companies perfected Fordism in digital form. Amazon turned warehouses into living assembly lines, where humans and algorithms move in synchronized rhythm. Efficiency is tracked to the second. Movement is optimized. Waste is eliminated. Tesla revived Ford's dream of vertically integrated production, bringing batteries, software, and vehicles under one unified industrial vision. Foxconn scaled the assembly line to planetary proportions, producing devices for billions through disciplined repetition. Different industries, same DNA. Fordism became the invisible operating system of capitalism. The core principles remained unchanged: standardization, scale, speed, and control of time. Production shapes consumption. Consumption justifies expansion. Workers adapt to machines. Markets adapt to output. The world accelerates because the system demands it. And there is no opting out. Even creativity bends to Ford's logic. Content is produced in volume. Art is optimized for platforms. Education is standardized. Data replaces intuition. Efficiency becomes the metric of success, not meaning. What can be replicated survives. What cannot is pushed to the margins. This is Ford's shadow. Yet the legacy is not purely dark. Ford's system lifted millions into the middle class. It lowered costs, expanded access, and democratized goods once reserved for elites. Mobility, comfort, and convenience became normal rather than exceptional. The modern standard of living: its abundance, its reliability would be impossible without mass production. But every gain carries a cost. As systems scale, individuals shrink. Workers become interchangeable. Identity is subordinated to output. Purpose is measured in productivity. The same question that haunted Ford's factories now haunts the global economy: when efficiency becomes sacred, what happens to the human being inside the machine? That question remains unresolved. Henry Ford was not a philosopher. He did not write manifestos about society. Yet his ideas outlived him precisely because they were practical. They worked. And because they worked, they spread. Governments adopted them. Corporations refined them. Algorithms automated them. The modern world runs on Ford's logic, whether it acknowledges it or not. Which leads to the final truth. Henry Ford did not invent the automobile. Others had done that before him. He did not invent the engine, the wheel, or even the assembly line. What he invented was something far more powerful: a system that made speed scalable, labor controllable, and production unstoppable. He did not just change how things were made. He changed how time, work, and value were understood. That is his real legacy. And now the question passes to us. In a world still accelerating under Ford's rules, can humanity reclaim meaning without destroying efficiency? Can systems serve people, rather than absorb them? Or are we forever bound to the rhythm he set more than a century ago? If this story made you think differently about the world you live in, about work, technology, and power, let us know in the comments. Share your perspective. Debate the legacy. And if you want more deep explorations into the hidden systems that shape history, don't forget to subscribe. Because understanding how the world was built is the first step toward deciding where it goes next.